Hello, everybody.
But Emmanuel's just coming back.
Yeah, but we need to 5, so we can't really wait, unfortunately. So welcome, everybody, to a very first of our fall 2024 Scholars in the Square series. Hello to those of you who are joining us through Zoom and YouTube in the future or in the present. Now, a quick word about format, since it will be new to some of you. Dr. Rebekka King will present her research in about 20 minutes, even under 20 minutes, we don't know, but 20 minutes. There will be a 20-minute period in which she will engage in conversation with someone who knows her research field well. In this case, the interlocutor is Dr. Chris Douglas, former acting director of the center and professor in our English department. After Rebekka and Chris talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a discussion period with members of the actual and the virtual audiences for the final 20 minutes. Rachel will give all of you who are joining us today on Zoom instructions about how to participate that way. Now, our speaker today is Dr. Rebekka King, a professor of religious studies at Middle Tennessee State University. She teaches and researches in the area of North American religions, cultural anthropology, and sociology of religion. Rebekka was a fellow at the center when she was finishing her PhD at the University of Toronto back in 2011, and I'm so delighted to have her back. I've learned a great deal from our conversations and collaborations ever since I first met her, which was when she was just a grad student doing her MA at Queen's University, which was quite a long time ago. So I'm so glad that you've stayed in touch. She's currently the president of the North American Society for the Study of Religion. In 2023, she authored The New Heretics, Skepticism, Secularism, and Progressive Christianity. And she's also co-edited the book's Key Categories in the Study of Religion and Representing Religion in Film, both of which were released in 2022. I'm so happy she's chosen to spend some of her well-deserved sabbatical time with us here, working on a new, though I think still related, set of issues. It seems to me that much of Rebekka's work underlines the value of seeing religious groups and ideas as being comprehensible only against a backdrop of quite specific cultural and political processes. No one hovers outside of history. And at the center, we try to find ways to connect all of our work to the worlds we have made and inherited. And so by way of some final words of introduction, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Osage peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. So please join me in welcoming our dear friend and esteemed colleague, Rebekka King.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to be with everyone online. I want to begin with the origin stories about this project. Like all of the best things in my life, this project came from a student. In my early days as an assistant professor, a student who I thought had withdrawn from the class unexpectedly appeared to take the midterm exam. Despite having missed several key lectures, he attempted to answer the questions, and when he didn't know the answers, he did what we all do. With a mix of caffeine and determination, he made educated guesses based on what little he remembered from the classes. One of the exam questions asked the student to define language ideologies using our readings and class discussions, and his answer included a reflection on theological aspects of Christian glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, a topic that we touched upon in the course, but was not directly related to the prompt. The student dedicated an entire page of his blue book to a theological outline of various tenets, and most intriguingly, he referred to the language used in speaking in tongues as Enochian. So when I handed the exams back to him, I asked him about it. I said, where does this come from? Do you mean like Enoch, the guy from Genesis? And the student shrugged his shoulder. He said, I don't know, that's what my pastor says. He says that when we speak in tongues, we are speaking the language that the angels taught Enoch. At first, I kind of set this aside as part of a large collection of anecdotes about weird things that were happening to me while I live in Tennessee. However, over the years, Enoch continued to kind of appear in my midst in these unexpected places. For example, I'd be teaching about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a student would raise their hand and start asking questions about celestial speech and primordial languages. Or we'd be discussing Black revivalist religious movements, and a student would tell me that her aunt said that Enoch was the founder of the Church of Ethiopia. And one student came by my office, especially rather recently, and gave me a short story that she'd written in which the main character cast spells using Enochian. And I asked her, how she learned the language. And she replied, well, from a video game. And so at that point, I thought, okay, there's something going on here, and I am in. So today I'm going to be sharing with you my new research project, which examines contemporary receptions of the Book of Enoch. And in doing so, I'm going to show that Enoch serves as what scholar of religion Timutara calls a floating signifier, a category that is not a static, inherently defined concept, but rather subject to constant redefinition and negotiation, depending on cultural, social, and political contexts. This research contributes, I hope, to a new turn in critical comparative studies of religious texts and argues for consideration of scripturalizing, right? Attention to what Richard Newton says is the way that there's a tension between how people read texts and they also seem to read them back. So I will begin by offering a brief overview of the historical Enoch before moving into an analysis of some contemporary examples, and conclude with some of my preliminary observations about the project's development. And I do want to say it's very much so a work in progress. So this is my first time presenting on it. So I hope that you will offer me any and all feedback. What am I doing wrong?
Try again.
Here we go. Oh, there we go. All right, so let's start with the biblical Enoch. The biblical Enoch first appears embedded in a genealogical list as basically a bit character. In Genesis 5, he appears as the son of Jared, the father of Methuselah, and we're later told the great-grandfather of Noah. So it says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. And that's all we get. Or probably better put, that's all that remains of what it was probably a much longer story that circulated in antiquity. But it's intriguing, right? Why did God take him? Where did God take him? Is he okay? Right? And as those in this room and online who are familiar with biblical studies know, the questions that I just asked are questions that were asked in ancient times, right? The limited biblical account prompted early interpreters to begin asking and imagining what happened to Enoch during this time that he was taken. So the Book of Enoch, or First Enoch, emerged during the Second Temple period in the late 4th or more likely early 3rd centuries BCE as part of a developing Judean apocalyptic tradition. It comprises 5 distinct sections and 2 appendices, and it really needs to be considered kind of a larger sort of compilation of texts that are part of a shared Enochic tradition that was stitched together and kind of took the form that I have up here around the 1st century BCE, if not maybe a little bit earlier. Our most complete copies are preserved in Ge'ez, which is the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, of which the Book of Enoch is part of their canon. And parts of the book in the original language in Aramaic were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. The different sections of First Enoch explore these themes about the nature of the universe, the fate of the soul, divine judgment, and many scholars believe that they profoundly influenced later Jewish and Christian thought. Probably the most interesting section is the first section, known as the Book of Watchers, which picks up the tradition of Enoch being taken and also draws from a brief reference in Genesis 6:4 to the legends of angels, or the sons of God, having descended from heaven to copulate with human women. And as a result, these women give birth to a race that was known as the Nephilim. And the verse from Genesis, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. They were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. So drawing inspiration from this short passage in Genesis, the Book of Watchers expands the story of the Nephilim, reporting that they taught humanity various forms of forbidden knowledge, which basically led to widespread corruption. The second part of the book traces Enoch's celestial journey, basically what happened when he was taken up by God. And according to First Enoch, following the havoc that was caused by the angels, Enoch is called upon to intercede for these fallen beings. He ascends the heavens where he's shown all of the secrets of the universe. He's taken on this wild journey of the heavenly realms. Each has a distinct topography and purpose. He visits fiery mountains, the tree of life. He's shown these prisons, these desolate places where the fallen angels are confined for their punishments, and the throne of God. And basically the whole text is giving us a sense of what the consequences are for divine rebellion, and the underlying themes are retribution, justice throughout the text. So it's a really wild story. And as best we can tell, it was probably pretty popular in the first century. However, it doesn't make it into the canon of the Hebrew Bible or the early church, with the exception of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has an expanded canon, and Enoch is part of it. We have records of some of the early church fathers promoting it. So Tertullian and Origen in particular both thought it was worthwhile. Others like Augustine and Athanasius believed that it was a spurious text and that it should be rejected. And they said it wasn't actually written by Enoch. So that's why they didn't want it to be part of the canon. There's a really funny story of Athanasius rejecting it for that reason, saying that they didn't have writing before the flood. So that's how he knew that Enoch didn't write it. But Jacob of Edessa in the 7th century responds to that and says, well, they had wine before the flood, so surely they had writing. And I just really like that. So by the early Middle Ages, apart from some quotations and obviously the Ethiopian version, which the church didn't know about, the text had disappeared from circulation. That being said, traditions about Enoch continued to circulate through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. We have records of various grimoires or magical books that were attributed to Enoch or thought to contain some of his astronomical knowledge or medicinal wisdom. And the fascination with Enoch doesn't end with First Enoch. There are also 2 other books that scholars now label as part of this Enochian corpus. Second Enoch, which is a 1st century text written in Slavonic that basically retells First Enoch. And then Third Enoch, which is a rabbinical mystical text from the 5th or 6th century, in which Enoch actually becomes an archangel known as the Metatron and sort of a lesser deity. So, as was the case in antiquity, the figure of Enoch continues to inspire diverse interpretations today. So my project is interested in trying to map out what's going on with contemporary portrayals of Enoch and examine how they serve as a forum for what Jean-Francois Bayard describes as operational acts of identification. This concept refers to the ways individuals and groups use cultural and historical symbols like Enoch to construct and express their identities. So the first step in my research has been to just try to gather together all of these different texts, a term that I'm using broadly to include books, websites, videos, podcasts, so many TikTok videos, and other forms of social media content. And through this, I've identified several key themes, and I'm going to share 3 of them that are Christian-based with you today. Okay. So my first example comes from an evangelical, charismatic, or Jewish affinity version of Christianity. Like the church that my former student attended, this group comprises of conservative Christians reading the text for insight into contemporary Christian practices and beliefs. Many within this camp see the Book of Enoch as providing access to information that is otherwise missing from their Bible, and specifically information about angels and demons. And they claim that Enoch is the first to ever attest the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, and that Enoch contains clues about the imminent end times or the rapture. So we're going to watch a brief clip of one of these figures.
Hi, Steve here. I'm back in the book of Enoch again because the revelations he brought to us were clearly for this generation. The last generation that will live for the end times judgments and wrath of God is poured out on Satan's kingdom. I have a message for the church. The devil does not want you to read the book of Enoch. Why? Because God showed him things that the devil does not want you to know. The devil wants you to go on in life being deceived, complacent, and comfortable in your ignorance and naivety.
So this gives you kind of a sense of what some of that looks like. My second representative text in this group is an example from Zach Bauer, who is the host of the American Homesteaders podcast, and music content creator Jake Grant. And these two really exemplify the Joe Rogan style of podcast culture. Their discussion centers on the Book of Enoch as a valuable educational and religious resource, and they highlight its narratives about angels, giants, the pre-flood world. They discuss the book's exclusion from canon, and they argue that it's been deliberately excluded by ecclesiastical authorities. They suggest that it was Jewish authorities who suppressed the book specifically because it so clearly contains prophecies about Jesus as the Messiah. And you can see in the quote there, they're talking about how it's like so messianic, right? And like it's the language of the Son of God and everything. And so this example, I think, really helps illustrate how Enoch bridges canonical texts and lived religious experiences of believers today. I think that for this cohort, Enoch's place outside of the Protestant canon places it in a way that it's almost biblically adjacent and allows them to be sort of playful with it in a way that they might not otherwise be with the Bible itself. It provides a gateway to envisioning a proto-Christian other, a pre-Christian Jewish community that would have believed in Jesus in opposition to Jewish rabbinical traditions that developed later that did not. And in this context, it allows them to allows us to see as scholars how parabiblical literature can be seen as a manifestation of Christian sort of quest for authenticity and origins. All right, my second example are angelic alien equivalence adherents. I've given that name. I probably will change it at some point. A second subgroup contains interpreters who come from a Christian background but hold certain paranormal or alternative beliefs. It comprises of those who argue that Enoch is the origins of humans' first contact with aliens. So representative of this group is The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim by Scott Allen Roberts. He suggests that the Nephilim, as described in Enoch, were the offspring of extraterrestrial beings and human women. He argues that this intersection of divine beings and humans contributed to early civilization by introducing advanced knowledge and technologies. By reinterpreting the story in light of sort of modern ufology, he's challenging the conventional historical and religious narratives so that the stories of the Nephilim and their divine status, as depicted in the Book of Enoch, are really just sort of the best attempt by simple-minded humans to understand aliens, thinking that they are divine beings, right? And part of what's really interesting about him is that while some of the interpreters cast the Nephilim in a positive light as like these aliens who brought us all this awesome technology, Roberts thinks that they are nefarious. In his view, the Watchers' descent was an attack on humankind, and their aim was to interbreed with humans in order to create a hybrid worker class race that they could then enslave for free labor. And so I find particularly interesting is that as Roberts is unpacking and drawing this theory, he's pulling from a number of sort of ancient texts, Sumerian, Mayan, Egyptian, and Vedic, but his argument really relies on the idea that the Hebrew Bible has to be historically accurate, especially the Garden of Eden and the Exodus narrative. And that's tied to the fact that those stories have reptiles in them or snakes in them. And so he needs it not only to be historically accurate, but he needs Moses to have been the author in order for all of his theories to kind of stay together. The point has a lot of uncomfortable resemblances with some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy hate literature that people like David Icke promote. And Roberts actually addresses that in one of his chapters where he says that he's not like Icke because Icke is anti-Semitic and a neo-fascist. And Roberts says, well, I'm not a Nazi, so you can trust me because I'm not a Nazi, right? And so part of what I think is really interesting there is how like he's able to kind of employ these sort of comparisons with other thinkers who hold similar views in order to legitimate his claims. All right, my last group are Black Ethiopianism movements. Within this movement, it asserts that African Americans and other people of African descent are not just connected to ancient Israelites, but also inherit a direct line from biblical figures such as Enoch. And by focusing on Ethiopian connections, they are able to reestablish a foundational role in the narratives from both Judaism and Christianity, highlighting Ethiopia's ancient Christian traditions. The movement has roots in broader Ethiopianism ideology, which historically has seen Ethiopia as a symbol of African independence and pride. And within this framework, the Book of Enoch, which holds canonical status in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, really becomes this critical text. It serves not only as a religious, but also a cultural anchor and a symbol of enduring African spirituality and wisdom. Representative of this group is a book by Indus Kamek Kush, Enoch the Ethiopian, Greater Than Abraham, Holier Than Moses, which really embodies this perspective. He argues that the exclusion of Enoch from traditional biblical canon is due to the text's profound African roots, suggesting that Enoch's diminished role in mainstream Christian and Jewish traditions is part of a broader effort or white conspiracy aimed at obscuring the true lineage and legacy of the Hebrews. So this narrative not only reclaims Enoch's significance, but also reinforces claims by proponents of Black Ethiopianism to authentic and original religious heritage. All right, so how am I analyzing this? As I've already stated, I'm in the early stages of organizing this data. However, I do have some preliminary frameworks that I think are helpful for understanding what is happening. As I mentioned, Enoch serves as a floating signifier, a concept that captures his variable significance across different cultural and historical periods. And I think this adaptability makes Enoch a really interesting topic or subject to talk about. Drawing from Pierre Bourdieu's work, we can see that there's something at work around the concept of authority and symbolic capital and the role of authorized spokespersons. In Bourdieu's assessment, authoritative spokespersons are individuals who have accumulated some form of symbolic capital to be recognized as legitimate voices within a particular field or social space. And his notion of symbolic capital, essentially the academic currency and credibility, helps us understand why these Enoch traditions are able to kind of gain some traction. Most importantly, in the case of contemporary Enoch, authoritative spokespersons' power is not necessarily derived from formal authority or expertise, but rather on the ability to have one's speech recognized and accepted within a particular domain. And in doing so, they're able to define legitimacy that often reinforces their own status quo. So for example, when I was talking about Jake Grant and Zach Bauer, they spend a lot of time reassuring their audience that they have read the scholarly texts on Second Temple Judaism, or at least Wikipedia summaries of the works. And although they're reading it through this lens of conservative hermeneutics, they spend as much time rooting Enoch in the Bible in the early church history. And I think that helps us understand something about the way that they're performing a certain form or level of authority. In Capitalizing Religion, Craig Martin, who's the current president of Nasser and the past president now, describes the concept of exotic capital, which denotes forms of social capital that gain power precisely through their foreignness or alterity in the eyes of communities that employ them. And so he says that there's something about this exotic capital that because something is not mastered by the groups that employ it, it's able to kind of gain extra power and tap into a romanticized, imaginary, and certain forms of nostalgia. And I see that very much so at work within the Black Ethiopianism movement. Capital arises not only from the text's sort of ancient mystical qualities, but also from its association with Ethiopian heritage and the idea of an ancient form of Christianity that would have been untouched by colonial influences. And so this frames the Book of Enoch as somehow a pure or more authentic source of religious and historical truths, and allows sort of a reclaiming of an identity that is perceived of as both ancient and authentically African. Moreover, the exotic capital within Enoch, specifically in that context, but I think more broadly in many of the examples I'm looking at, is enhanced by this notion of a rediscovery and a resistance to an established sort of elite. The narrative that Enoch was suppressed or marginalized in Christian and Jewish traditions adds this layer of allure, positioning the text as somehow hidden knowledge that has been kept away from mainstream religious discourse. And this not only increases the value of the text, but aligns it with broader themes of uncovering and reclaiming suppressed histories and identities. So together, I think these theories elucidate how Enoch as flame signifier is not just a static character from ancient texts, but this dynamic symbol that is able to continuously be reshaped. His adaptability allows him to function with various ideological frameworks, serving as somehow a tool either to reinforce or challenge existing religious paradigms. And in doing so, there's this ongoing negotiation of signification within religious texts that reflect broader social dynamics and processes of meaning making. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm currently I teach the Bible as literature here at the University of Victoria, and we're currently working our way through the book of Genesis. And
have you gotten to the Nephilim yet?
Yes, we've gotten to, I just sort of pointed it out, like you say, it's just like one sort of sentence and then we move on. But I'm trying to get my students to see that a lot of times in Genesis, there are these sort of gaps and silences and ellipses in the text where there's this kind of missing information. And, this is a key one. I mean, Enoch is a whopper of an ellipsis, because here you have this guy that's taken up to heaven. And like you say, is he still okay? Or, what's happened to him? Where does he go see? And what I really appreciated about your presentation was I think you're showing that Enoch is almost a kind of living literary tradition, even to this. So you're talking about the book of First Enoch, and then Second Enoch and Third Enoch, back in the past, but it still has this capacity today to, enliven people and get them thinking about, alternative forms of knowledge and all that kind of thing. So I think it's a really productive way of, a really interesting way to show how this is still going on today. I guess one of the questions as I was listening to your presentation that was prompted for me was, why are these all dudes who are doing this? Like, why are they all men? They seem to be all guys. And are there any women who are kind of like exploring the Enochian tradition? And, or do you have a theory about like, why is it all men who are drawn to this sort of like secret knowledge and that kind of thing?
Gosh, that's such a good question. And I think so part of it, I will find women.
Okay.
Find the women. And if you find women.
But have you found them yet?
No, I haven't. And I think part of it probably has to do with the fact that I'm looking at kind of conservative Christian evangelical traditions that are very patriarchal. Like these are churches where women don't speak, right? And so I'm sure the women are watching. It'd be interesting to try to figure out what it's doing for them, or if they are doing something slightly different than men in the audience might be doing, or why are there no non-binary people, right? Well, I guess again, it's a tradition that largely doesn't accept the idea of being non-binary. But I suspect if I was looking at kind of a Unitarian tradition or something like that, I would probably find women who are reading it with very different aims, but possibly similar to modalities, right?
Well, I mean, it's strange because there's the one line about Enoch, and then there's the 4 verses about the sons of God coming and copulating with human women, which really doesn't sound very consensual to me. I mean, so it's a kind of gendered story in the first place, right? And so that made me wonder if that has some effect on why some authors are returning to this kind of. I mean, it strikes me as a kind of Genesis fan fiction that you're dealing with, but also that's what Enoch was in the first place, in a sense. It's kind of a Genesis fan fiction, filling in those gaps, thinking about what happened to Enoch afterwards, and so that's a continuous literary tradition. And I had a couple of books that I had in mind as I was reading and then thinking about your presentation, and that's Anethea Portier-Young's Apocalypse Against Empire. I don't know if you've been able to take a look at that, but she calls Watchers an alternative theodicy insofar as it addresses questions about the origins of evil, and it elaborates on that Enoch account and the Genesis 6 account. But also Annette Yoshiko Reed's book, Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism, in which she says that Enochian literature was a way for Jewish scribes to systematically respond to Mesopotamian and Greek knowledge, detailing angelology, cosmology, and other bodies of learning, but ascribing their priority to Enoch. Right, so there are kinds of, so it seems to me that even in its origin, Enochian literature was a kind of like literature of resistance. And I wonder, is that a through line in the work that you're, in the three sort of subgroups that you're working with? Apocalypse could be understood as a kind of resistance against empire. Enochian, like the books that are in the Book of the Watchers, or the other works ascribed to Enoch, could also be understood to be trying to resist greater knowledge empires in the area at the time by trying to say, well, this figure from ancient Judaism got there first, in a sense, and he was taken up to heaven and that kind of thing. So resisting larger, more powerful groups seems to be kind of like a through line. This is what I'm thinking. So do you see that at all in the groups that you're like? So even up to if you think about it as a continuous literary tradition, even up to the present, is there kind of a similar sense of, I don't know, like resistance? Or I think you mentioned that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that question actually ties really well, even more so with the work that you have done on the Left Behind series, right? That the apocalyptic literature serves as this place where there's kind of this practicing of vengeance and violence in the face of like kind of a feeling where, evangelical Christians feel like maybe they've lost control over the narrative, right? Yeah. They're sad that we're not living in like their kind of Christian nationalist world. And also, as you argue, that it also gives them a chance to kind of respond to God's absence, right? That God isn't responding to the world, which from their perspective is terrible, because it's not sort of bowing down before God. So I think you could probably see some of that. A lot of these people are kind of into that sort of, they're very much so anti-vaxxers, right, and kind of that reptilian people. And this
goes back to the anti-elite knowledge that you were talking about.
Yeah, so I think there's some of that, although I'm fascinated because you talk about some of the scholars working in biblical studies like Reed and John Collins and people like that. They've also, I'm not sure they've read as extensively, but they at least were able to play with those names. And so it's interesting to me the way that they're using biblical scholarship to kind of build their own credibility in certain ways.
That's interesting. Yeah. If you, let's say you could get these three groups into a room together. I found it fascinating. I mean, I think your categories totally make sense, and I don't think you should change the alien. What is it? Alien angel. What was the category you used? Equivalency. Yeah. I think that's great. I think you should probably keep that. But let's see, you can get these three groups in a room all to talk about Enoch. How does that conversation go? Do you think can they agree on anything, or are they at loggerheads already and trying to sort of think about what Enoch means?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think they'd all agree that Enoch is important. You know what? I don't think they would agree, but I'm not 100% sure that they would notice that they weren't agreeing.
Interesting.
Right? And I don't mean to sound disparaging there. I think, again, Enoch is almost like when I talk about this floating signifier, the term has this meaning that they have placed on it, but they then presume that it's going to signify that thing. So it's almost like this kind of religious shorthand, right? That once you say the word, it speaks into power certain frameworks and assumptions. So they would hear someone else saying it and presume that that person is saying the same thing they're saying. Yeah.
And when you talked about Roberts, I love the story of, Book of the Watchers, the angels come down and they all have, particular names and seemingly like specializations. And some bring metallurgy and some bring cosmetics. These are understood to be. But you talked about, for the most part, some of the alien equivalency folk think that the watchers or the angels, the sons of God, brought beneficial things. What were those? What were the, like, in that corpus, what are the beneficial things? Is that like the pyramids? We got the pyramids because the angels told us how to build them, or what?
Yeah, so I'm not sure, like, so I'm still doing some of the collection of that data. What I have seen is that in their mind, that then accounts for what they see as a rapid, like, technological sort of advancement, because of course, the universe is only 6,000 years old, right? So like you have to understand why all of a sudden we had all this technology, right? So yeah, it's more that sort of stuff. And then they were kind of, chased off by other aliens because they're this sort of breakaway group. And so they shared all this wonderful knowledge with us, and then bad aliens came and told them they had to leave. It's very kind of Star Trek-esque, right?
Where are the aliens now? Are there any in this room?
Robert thinks so, and I haven't read a second book yet, but I'm not quite sure. So they're probably not in this room.
Yeah. They are invisible though, right? You don't know that.
Yeah, maybe. Oh gosh. Yeah, so I think there's also this idea that maybe they're going to come back once we've advanced technologically, which kind of ties into that Star Trek framework.
Well, that you bring that up, the Star Trek, I found really interesting, because in some ways, it almost seemed as though Enoch is kind of like a science fiction in antiquity, almost like there's this sort of, he literally goes up into the sky, I guess. Elijah, at least we understand that he rides in a chariot of fire into the sky, so we know his manner of being taken up. We don't know that with Elijah, but he does go into the heavens, I guess. And in the Enochian literature, as you mentioned, like he looks around and there's different geographies, and he's boldly going where no man has gone before, really. So is it useful to think about this Enochian literature and its after effects in the kind of the three groups that you're looking at as being a kind of like speculative fiction or kind of fan fiction about the cosmos that we see sometimes in stuff like Star Trek today?
Yeah, I think I think that's a great question, right? And when I teach my religion and film class, I talk a lot about sort of the relationship between, because there are some theorists in film studies who think that there's something about science fiction that kind of makes it uniquely able to sort of deal with religious issues.
Interesting.
The question you're asking, though, kind of asks me to flip it, right? So it's starting in antiquity and thinking, like, is this somehow kind of a precursor? So I wouldn't say it's only science fiction, certainly, and because nothing is ever only one thing. But I think it's doing something similar. Like, I'm of the school of thought that thinks that part of what religious narratives do is they answer questions of what it means to be human through telling stories about things that are more than human or other than human. So I see that at work in this story in a way that's very similar to what science fiction does, what good science fiction does, but really what any good literature does.
I'm a bit surprised, given the interlocutor we chose, that you have yet to ask about the contemporary resonance among the particular political arena that you're both interested in. So when you're thinking about the people among whom these stories are popular, what about the kind of Trump orientation? You mentioned the anti-vax tendencies and so forth, but has Trump given these folks a new framework for thinking about the meaning of Enoch? Or has it always just been there?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know what? I probably need to spend some more time thinking about it. I tend to try to just close my eyes whenever there's anything Trump related happening, and then kind of will go away. But maybe
it's always my job to bug you about that.
A good use of my time in Canada when I'm safely ensconced in the Northland to think about that.
But from what you're saying, it sounds like the folks claiming Enoch as a Ethiopian ancestor are almost imagining a kind of like decolonizing they're almost doing that as a decolonizing claim or an anti-colonial claim, right? So I guess that is an interesting question about the politics.
But not the Joe Rogan types.
Oh,
No. But I guess that would be the question: is does this sort of appeal to are the Enoch scribes or Enoch reworkers, fan fiction writers in the present politically conservative in a way that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not, or is?
I think they would be politically. Oh, that's such a good question. Because there is sort of a degree of kind of conservatism within that movement as well.
Gender roles, especially.
Although a lot of people who are part of some of the Black revivalist movements will say that they feel like it's a place where women's teachings are sort of more available than perhaps other forms of Black Christianity. So I want to acknowledge that. But yeah, I think there is something to that in terms of conservatism, maybe like a lowercase c conservatism. Yes, right.
So thank you. And you don't have to answer all these questions now. I'm so glad that you're going to be with us for some months. So we now have, in the last section of our conversation, we kind of turn the conversation back to the rest of the room. If those of you on Zoom who want to get a question in, just let Rachel know and she'll kind of articulate your question for you. So are there any questions in the room? We tend to privilege folks who aren't fellows of the center, because tomorrow, of course, we'll tease out things with Rebekka. But are there any people in the room who have a question? See one from you.
Good.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Mormon fanfiction of
Enoch?
I
know I knew I was going to ask that. No, so I have one of my students, Matthew Pierce, who is planning to go into graduate school and is a brilliant young scholar. He was doing some research for me on this, and he took me aside and was like, Dr. King, I think you're going to need to learn about Mormons. So I'm familiar enough to know that I haven't done that research yet, and I look forward to it. But that's your area, so maybe we can connect and talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, I like these ideas that you're teasing out, because you're the idea that it's kind of adjacent to being canon makes it something playful. But within the LDS Church, they've canonized aspects of the Enoch story as scripture. In not just one book, but two different books. And it's not the full Enoch story. It's more like a summary or a fan fiction. But it has the elements of giants, and it has the elements of building a city and some other stuff. And as a result, maybe this might bolster your claim, but it's not treated playfully amongst Latter-day Saints, near as I can tell. It's because it is scripture. It's not something that you're supposed to speculate on. So I don't see people talking about aliens in the LDS Church. I don't see people using it in this kind of creative manner. It's a known entity. We know that it teaches these certain principles, and that's really all they have to say about it. So it might tie into this idea that when it's adjacent to being canon, you can be playful with it. But when it's become canonized, it's treated with more reverence.
Well, and part of what I think makes Enoch appealing is that his experience is very similar to Joseph Smith's in terms of speaking with angels and having these visions. And so there's something, because there's also the figure of Idris within the Muslim tradition, right? And similarly, it's not a playful thing, right? It's there's a more seriousness attached to it. So I would love to hear if there are kind of post Joseph Smith, kind of Mormon fan fiction-esque accounts of what Enoch is doing, to see how it, because if it's bolstering Smith, then that makes sense. But is there something that kind of is more recent? That would be fascinating.
I don't know of anything more recent. It's definitely.
Now you're going to see it, though.
I might
finding it places. You're not going to show up in your life.
Yeah. The way it's framed in a lot of the Joseph Smith scriptures, it's very much about foretelling the restoration. So to your point, it's kind of a story that gets reclaimed for a specific purpose that's related to what's going on at the time. So Smith kind of reclaimed the story in that way. I can't think of much modern stuff about it, other than the LDS version is the city, not just Enoch. The whole city of Enoch gets translated up into heaven. And so a lot of people will talk about the city of Zion or the city of Enoch as this exemplar city that we actually have a future we could work towards, where we become collectively so holy that we can be translated into the heavens.
Gary?
Thank you so much for that. I'm just wondering what sort of debates, if any, are happening within these communities, evangelical communities, around the interpretive question at stake here. Like, are there some more literalist fundamentalist voices saying, knock off this outlandish stuff, it's not doing the tradition any favors? It's like, so I'm just wondering how the internal debate is happening.
So more of the debate that I'm seeing is about the place of second Enoch and third Enoch in the tradition, and whether those are like sort of God inspired. For the most part, the people who would say like this isn't canon and there's a good reason that it's not canon, and kind of siding with Augustine or whatever, they would like they're not trying to engage beyond that. They're like, these are heretical texts. There were lots of heretical texts. Don't listen to those people who are trying to lead you astray. There's some conversations of people who will say, well, you should pray about it or trust God, and sort of if it makes sense, if it feels God breathed or whatever, then that makes it something maybe you could consider. They're also all very clear that no matter what, the Bible and Jesus are like, that's the main thing. So Enoch is supplementary.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Jessica Z. Can Cook just has a fairly simple question potentially, but maybe not. Saying, is there anything ever made of the scriptural statement that Enoch lived for 365 years, same as the number of days in a year?
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at that, but yeah, that's definitely, there's some scholarship around then tying that to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community, and trying to think about the type of calendar that they might have been using, because Enoch is discovered as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus. So there's sort of a sense that maybe Enoch is a version of ancient Judaism that had a solar rather than a lunar calendar. And so that's the evidence for that. Yeah, so that is actually a really interesting question.
Chris?
I liked the part of your talk where you talked about that oftentimes what Enoch gathers, it's almost like a magnet for thinking against the elites, right? It's an anti-elite form of knowledge. And I wonder how you thought about your place as a scholar, because we do elite knowledge here, right? But they're also claiming a kind of elite insider knowledge. So do you think that, I guess I'm wondering how you imagine, or what you imagine your role as a scholar is in this project. Is it sort of like kind of mapping the varieties of Enochian literature in the present? Are you going to try to inform or sort of like combat misinformation or map? Because I guess what strikes me is that some of the writers, as bad as this is, Roberts, when this eventually becomes a book, it'll be a great book, I think. It won't sell as much as Robert's books on reptiles and aliens, and as bad as that is. So, what is your place as a kind of scholar, sort of like looking at this knowledge that's all about, elite versus, anti-elite knowledge, and hidden secrets and that kind of thing?
Well, I don't think my job is to correct them.
Yeah.
But I do think that's probably like what the draw is for it, because it is like, especially like teaching Christianity and teaching Bible in the South.
Yeah.
Like, I have a captive audience in a way that I didn't have when I was in Canada, for people who really want to talk about the Bible and come from places that have taken these texts as a model for their lives. And so I think that's part of my interest in it, with keeping me engaged. But I don't see my role as correcting people and saying like, oh, you're wrong about reptilian aliens from outer space, or even corrections. And this is the one that's harder sometimes, is when they interpret the data from antiquity, and I want to be like, oh, that's not actually what John Collins says, or that's, but that again, I don't think that's my role, right?
Yeah.
I'm more interested in how they are making meaning, even in the places where maybe it departs from what I would consider an academic analysis.
Yeah.
But I wonder, like the story that Rebekka started with about her student coming and sort of talking about this is quite matter of fact.
Right.
Is it imaginable in your course with BC students, given the Cascadia environment?
Yeah.
Is it imaginable that such a student would do that? I can't even imagine. I mean, I could in Manitoba, I could imagine, but I can't imagine it here. Have you ever had that?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Yeah. And so you're doing your thinking and writing in a very particular context, where you might run into such a person, or if you turn on the radio, it's conceivable that you would hear an interview with these folks, which is very difficult to imagine here, I think. Francis.
Is there an idea of Enochian being a pre-Babel universal language?
Yeah, there's a lot of YouTube videos about that this is the language that God spoke, and it got corrupted sort of at various points, kind of out post Eden, and kind of ultimately lost with the Tower of Babel, and then sort of these attempts to try to rediscover it or find it. Yeah.
And that's what makes it a powerful language for spell casting, so it was the original.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it, but of course, John Dee, who in the 16th century, he had sort of believed that he was receiving this angelic language that sort of today many kind of hermetic followers see the language. And you can buy this book, like how to read and write Enochian and stuff like that. You kind of use it for casting spells.
That seems like to be useful. Have you tested any of that out?
I haven't. My dad flipped through it this summer when I was home visiting my family. I haven't had a chance to, but I'm sure I'll get there.
Yeah, sure.
That's a very simple question, and out of curiosity, I'm asking, what's the script of this language, and is this like a living language, or is this?
What is the script? I'm gonna mess this up. It kind of looks a little bit like cuneiform, maybe, or like ruins. There's obviously no tie to it in antiquity as the ancient language. But yeah, it has sort of letters. Yeah, and if you Google it, you would find sort of pictures of it.
Does the African origin of the Orthodox Ethiopian Church, the author that you were mentioning, who writes about Enoch, does he recognize that it looks like Enoch was first composed in Aramaic and then translated into Ge'ez, or does he think Ge'ez was the original language of it?
So that ties back to the points where I try not to insert what we know to be academically the case, because he actually says that the entire Bible was first written in an African language. So it would have been written in that language, which was an African language. Yeah. And the fact that we don't know that is part of the conspiracy.
Yeah.
Do you find, because this isn't a biblical text necessarily, well, it's not in the Bible, do you find that it's getting used in alternative spirituality, like the Enochian language, getting used in alternative spirituality, like Wiccan or paganism or things like that? And if so, how do they kind of deal with that? The fact that it is biblically associated.
Right. So they would, so you do see that in different ways. They're not doing kind of the space aliens from away or whatever. They are seeing it more as this angelic language that they can then use for casting spells or for various kind of magical processes. And in their justification, this is something that's in the Bible and that makes it stronger. But for them, the Bible and the historical context, they're also very much so tying it to Babylon and ancient Mesopotamia. And that's okay because it's the uncorrupted part that hasn't been destroyed by Christianity, which from their perspective would be, the real problem with Bible. So they're able to sidestep that question pretty easily.
This really seems to, sorry, did you have a follow-up?
No, I was just processing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to really, especially that second alien angel adjacency or equivalency, seems to really kind of blur the boundaries between what we traditionally think of as like a sciencey kind of thing about aliens and a supernatural thing about angels. I mean, do the authors ever sort of forthrightly sort of address that these are things that we traditionally have thought of as kind of like distinct things, but now maybe they're the same? I mean, aliens are angels, or bad angels in particular.
Yeah, they address it, and they kind of, I mean, their argument would be like the modern division of science and religion is a problem that didn't exist in antiquity.
Right.
Yeah, and I just find that so fascinating. It's similar to kind of the same impulse that we see with creation science, right? And the Ark encounter.
Right.
And that creationism relies on sort of an alternative science rather than being a miraculous story.
Right.
And there's something about this modern way of engaging with antiquity and the stories of God's providence in the world that requires them to do that science-esque framework.
That's really interesting because I mean, creation science really only kind of emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. So it was an attempt to sort of like backstop and prove scientifically the truth of a kind of literalist and inerrant reading of Genesis. So it's almost as though there's a recognition there that science is the only or primary form of authority in modernity, and therefore we have to sort of translate our religious beliefs in those terms. So you find that kind of going on here as well.
Yeah, and I'm interested in how where they're negotiating that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of negotiating, can't negotiate with the clock. So Scott, if you could just advance one to the next slide. So please join me in thanking Rebekka. Those of you who are new to the center, I'll just remind you that tomorrow we tease out today's lecture more slowly or over an hour with Rebekka tomorrow at the center at 11. And those of you who are online can please join us next week to hear Paige Tom, same time, same place, Called to the Bar, Religious Lawyering in the Secular Practice of Law. All right, thanks again, Rebekka.